What's up, everybody? I am your host, Chris Hampton.
And this is Nate Drolet.
And together we form Boogie Down Productions.
I have no idea.
Boogie Down Productions was a rap group, hip hop group in the, I guess, late 80s, fronted by one of the best MCs ever to touch a microphone, KRS-One. And KRS-One was also known as the teacher, and teachers give grades. So that's the connection. We're here today to talk about the downgrading of Alex Megos's Bibliography by Stefano Ghisolfi, and maybe even more important, downgrading and grading in general in a more broad sense.
Mm-hmm.
What was your thought when you saw that? First off, I was psyched that he did the thing when he did it.
Yeah.
I was excited to see that. But what was your thought when you saw the downgrading?
He waited for a little bit.
Yeah.
He posted initially. He was like, "Hey, I did it," and then I think it was maybe another 2 days or so, and then he commented. And my initial thought, I was a little mixed because normally, a lot of times I see people downgrade things, and I feel like there's a mix of reasons why things get downgraded. And I was like, does he just not feel like he's like up to the challenge? But really, like, he did a great job of explaining it. He was like, hey, like, I found better beta, which makes complete sense, especially with this route. Like, when you look at it's brand new. Yeah, one person had done it. And then after that one person had done it, Megos did it. There was a lot of video of Megos trying it. So from there, anyone who wants to try it already has such a leg up because they know, okay, this is viable beta. Anything I can improve upon from this is a step in the right direction. Where Megos had to fully invent the wheel on this thing. So it makes sense that he found better beta for both cruxes. And honestly, like, Stefano is kind of one of the most accomplished sport climbers there are out there. I mean, is his third 15C. He's done a bunch of 15Bs, and he's really just kind of grinded for years. Like, it's really cool to see. Like, it wasn't that long ago that for him, like, spending this much time for 15A was a huge deal. Like,
right.
Yeah, it's not like he's just some comp monster who had a little extra time post Olympics and was like, I guess I'll go out. I have no clue what grades mean. But I did the thing, and who knows, maybe it's 15D, maybe 15C. Like, this is someone with a lot of experience. So yeah, I think his reasoning made complete sense, and I thought he was really respectful the way he did it. I like that he waited. That wasn't his initial first post was like, hey, I think it should be downgraded. It was, I put in this work, I'm celebrating it, I'm excited. And then later on, he, came back and said, hey, this is more on how I feel.
Yeah, I think that was a smart play. And I think most people, when they see a post that's like, oh, here's this lauded route that I just did, and I think it should be downgraded, I think most people are like, oh shit, shots fired,
Yeah.
And that's not actually the case.
At least not right now.
Yeah. And I think these two guys did a really great job of explaining that in their posts. And I'm going to read Stefano's post here. He said, yesterday and the day before, I wanted to focus more on my journey, the climb, and the people around the story of bibliography. I avoided on purpose talking about grades, but seems inevitable to do so. I took a day to think about it to find the right words. When I started trying bibliography, I couldn't imagine I could climb it in one season. Watching Alexander Megos video the route seemed impossible. And if it took him 60 days, I start projecting it, thinking to come back over the years. In the end, I felt good on it from the beginning, found new beta for the crux, switching left and right hand compared to Alex, and new beta for the second crux. I climbed it in a total of 25 climbing days during this 3 months, and I tried to compare it to Change and Perfecto Mundo, changing my mind every other day. Change took me around the same time, and Perfecto Mundo a bit more, but I feel all the three routes could fit all in the same grade range. I know I can climb a 9C, but for a route to be that grade, it needs to be much harder than the existing 9B pluses. And bibliography, for me, isn't. This doesn't mean I want to belittle the performance of anyone, neither Alex's or mine. It's still an incredible achievement, especially the first ascent that includes many more hard mental and physical aspects. But I just wanted to be honest about what I felt during the whole process on bibliography. And this is just my opinion. Hopefully, we'll listen to others soon. I would have been happy to be the third person to have climbed 9C, but in my heart, I know I'm not yet. And part of me, this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you. Part of me is like, do we need to still explain ourselves with this stuff? And part of me is like, hey, really good job on a lot of fronts. You know, number one, not be making sure you say this doesn't belittle Alex or my achievement.
Yeah.
This is still a major thing for both of us, and the world of climbing in general. And I'm being honest and transparent about how I felt about it. And I think that's great. But I'm also in the camp of, shouldn't everybody just know now that these grades are a suggestion and they're not this hard etched in stone thing that we can't waver on, we can't go back and forth on? That it's a super blurry thing to even begin to talk about. So I had mixed feelings on it.
I mean, that'd be nice if that was how it was.
Yeah, I would.
If we could just say, hey, like, I think, like, uh, in prep for this conversation, I was thinking about different routes, and take that Katie Brown came up.
Yeah.
Big reachy move. You have done it. I haven't. I've tried it a lot. I've gotten through the crux on point once, fell up higher, but man, if that thing, like, if someone was like, yeah, that's 13D, I wouldn't blink. I'd be like,
That's
yep.
what I honestly feel it is. It's graded 8A. It's graded
Mhm.
13B. When I did it, I felt like it was one of the hardest routes I'd ever done, and it felt like 13D to me.
Yeah, like that. And it's a huge move, zero intermediates. Like, there's just
Mm-hmm.
no, like, you can't be stronger than this move other than to just be really strong at max extension for people our height. And yeah, like, to me, if I were to climb that, like, if we lived in a world where you just suggested the grade you felt, I'd be like, yeah, 13D all day. Now, if someone who was 6'4" came by and was like, yeah, I think that's like 13B, maybe 13A. It's funny because in this case, I'd be like, yeah, that makes complete sense that should feel
Yeah.
this way, because this is so obvious. It's such a reach dependent climb that I can detach any sort of ego or feelings of like self worth from this rock climb. Now, if
Yeah.
it's something else that isn't just a giant 5.5 foot span on it, and I'm like, wow, this feels like the hardest thing I've ever done, and someone else is like, it feels about 2 grades easier to me, it's hard for me not to like bristle a little bit.
Yeah, your ego is going to get involved with it, whether we want it to or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's we're always hearing one of two kind of ends of this spectrum of thought when we're talking about grades. It's either the people who are like super grade chasing on one side and all they want to talk about is grades, and then the other side who's like, grades aren't important at all. I don't care about grades.
Yeah.
How hard was that thing you just did? And it's we have to talk about them. And
Mhm.
I'm glad that Stefano in this post says, I purposely avoided talking about the grade for those couple of days but I think it's inevitable. I don't think I can avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciated that. So Megos made a post, I think the next day or day after.
Hmm.
And one of the things he brought up in it was how he was like, in my mind, I kind of thought it was like 15C, but other people made me feel like it was probably harder.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's the same thing, like taking outside input. And I got to say, when he did it, I was like, it's got to be 15D. Like,
15D. Of course it is.
of
Yeah.
course, like he did biography in 3 tries in a single session. Like, no one. No one talks about sending 515 in a single session. You talk about sending hard boulders in a single session. 3 goes, one day, a route that's 50 feet to the left of this new climb that just took him 60 days.
Right.
I mean, that's math. Like,
Which doesn't always apply here, sadly,
oh no, and it
as much as we want it to.
no, and we wanted it to. Like years ago, I was in Ceuse, I think 5 years ago, and he was there, and I got to watch him on some of his earliest attempts on that line, and it blew me away. Like I've never seen. I think he linked like a big 4-bolt section somewhere in like maybe the first third, and I've never seen so many hard moves linked together. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't just like, oh, this person's strong and I can't tell how hard this is. It was like, no, he's holding tension, trying hard, and doing that for like 4 straight bolts. And it was wild. I was like, I remember him coming down being like, I don't know. I don't know if it can happen.
Hmm.
And I was like, yeah, I don't know either, man. Like I'm not not trying to be
Yeah.
disparaging, but that looked nails and you climbed only like on a third of it. So of
Hmm.
course when he did it, I was like, call it what you want. Call it 516. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to make a shift from those first days of trying it when you're figuring out moves, when every single move feels at your limit, to okay, I figured out the best method. I've now got it dialed in. This whole section feels drastically easier than it did at the beginning of this process. It's tough to make those shifts, and especially when you're Alex Megos, who hasn't done a ton of first ascents, hasn't done much developing at all, hasn't had to figure out a ton of sequences
Hmm.
on his own. That whole process has got to be a little bit confusing, and you've got all this pressure from the outside world. I've got his post pulled up too, and I'm going to read it.
Word.
And this was in response to Stefano's post about the grade. 9B plus, 9C. What's the difference, and how do you know which grade to give? At the beginning, I thought the number of days you invest in a climb is the best indicator of how hard it must be. Therefore, I thought trying bibliography for 60 days must be harder than anything I've climbed before. When the word spread that I did the route, people immediately started speculating. I think they were speculating way before. I always had the feeling that 9C might not be the appropriate grade for the route, but I felt some pressure from the climbing world, which was already saying that it must be 9C if it took me 60 days. I also didn't have a very good feeling for the grade anymore in the end because I simply changed my beta so many times, I had such long breaks on the route, and was struggling to compare it with other routes I did. I underestimated how much of a difference it makes to know you have the right beta. On bibliography, I thought I had good beta until I came back a season later to completely change it again. And that happened twice. So in the end, I probably spent the bigger part of 60 days figuring out beta, changing it again, and not being sure that I can do it. I became more and more convinced that it had to be harder than anything I'd ever done before. When Stefano and a few others started trying, they found new beta for both cruxes, both betas I hadn't tried when I was working on the route. I asked myself, how can that be? I spent so many hours on just a few square meters of rock, I should have seen every option. I realized at some point I was so convinced that I had the right beta that I stopped trying other things. I, of course, touched the holds of the new beta, but I never actually tried 100% to see if it makes sense. Every time I changed beta on the route, it was mainly because I couldn't climb the previous beta. At a certain point, I just decided that this will be the beta I'll climb it with, and I stopped trying new things. I did succeed in the end, but I've learned something for the future. I'm so grateful for your honest opinion, Stefano. I agree with 9B plus, and now I'll keep looking with Stefano for the next potential 9C. I mean, like we've already said, I think it's brilliant of these two to have this conversation. And, something that in the very beginning of this post that Alex said that I think is a really interesting take is that in the beginning he thought the number of days he spent on a route was some indicator of the difficulty.
Hmm.
And while it might be some indication, I think a lot of people put way too much focus on the amount of time a thing takes um, in relation to the grade.
Yeah.
Because you and I both have had, V8 take us longer than some V10s, or,
Yeah. Yeah.
13B take longer than some 13Cs or Ds. So 100%, they're always going to be these outliers that don't fit you perfectly, take you longer. They may not be harder, they might just be harder for you
Hmm.
because you lack whatever skill or whatever component is needed to climb it in its most efficient manner. And with a first ascent, there's a lot of that at play, no matter
Oh
who you
man.
are, no matter
Yeah.
if you're Alex Megos, Adamondra, doesn't matter. The first ascent is always going to be harder because you're figuring out sequences. You're in this case, you're doing it pretty much on your own, and so
Hmm.
you're seeing it through only your lens instead of having the benefit of Stefano gets on it and he can see it through Alex's lens via all the video, and then he gets to apply his own lens to it and see things in a different way.
Hmm.
So it's
And,
always going to be easier for the next person.
and Stefano got to. I'm assuming he probably saw Seb
Yep.
Bowen climb on it. Dave Graham was out there climbing on it. It wouldn't surprise me. I know Daniel Woods and other strong climbers are out there. Wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
surprise me if they went up it. So, I mean, even if he just watched them and didn't adopt any of their beta, like he got to see other people on it, like get other opinions of, oh, I don't, like I think this bolt section is really hard, but this section, like you'll definitely be able to rest here. Even just having these conversations is so helpful with sport climbs.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, like for Megos, it was just him. Like that's a huge difference.
Yeah. Another thing Alex says in this post is that, he would come back a season later and it would feel different to him than it did prior. And I think that's really important. And it makes me happy that I'm glad Alex gave it the grade he did. Like, I think it's a needed thing to allow for maybe this is the hardest thing that's ever been done. One of the hardest things that's ever been done. Maybe it's harder than anything I've climbed, allow yourself that room. So I'm glad Alex said maybe this is 15D. And and then I'm glad that he rethought along the way based on how it felt in that moment. And subsequently, when Stefano does it, he gives the grade pretty quickly, within a couple of days. And where I'm going with this is our memories are horrible. Um,
Yes.
there's a massive body of research saying that our memories are very, very fallible. Um, and I was talking about this with our mutual friend Zach a while ago about, do you think it's better to give a grade after you've reflected on it for a while or immediately after?
Hmm.
Like, do you start thinking about the grade and give it the grade then or after days and days of reflection? And I could see it both ways. So what I did, just as a, little N of one experiment, I asked Zach, what's the something, there's a measurement that we are using regularly, mileage when you're driving. We're always doing it. We know how many miles we've driven. We look at Google Maps or GPS, and it says this many miles, and then we drive it. So we're constantly testing this, and it's a concrete thing. It's not subjective like grades are. So
Hmm.
we should be really good at saying, okay, I know exactly how far a mile is. We've driven, we've traveled millions of them. So Zach and I were talking, and he said, from this boulder to this boulder on the highway, they're both right off the highway, half a mile. And then we drove it, and it was 5 miles.
Hmm.
In his memory, it was only half a mile away,
Yeah.
and we had driven between those boulders a bunch of times. But the reality is that, he's 10 times too short. So I don't know how we can expect to come back to a grade a season later, a year later, and say, okay, now I'm sure it's this. Like
Hmm.
I've reflected on it for a year. Now I'm positive it's this grade. I just don't think we have the ability to do that. We can think we do, but I don't think we do.
It, yeah, I can see where you're coming from with this. I think one time where it can change for me personally is the moment, like those times where you're like, oh man, I'm really close to doing this. And I feel like I was much more susceptible to this earlier in my climbing, which probably means I'm doing it right now, but I don't realize it. Um, but it's that idea of like, man, I'm real close. Like, oh, any go now, any session. And then you come back the next year and then you're like, oh, actually now I'm close. And you realize you were never close. Like you were maybe
Right.
geographically close to sending something, but you're like, oh, I thought this was the link. No, 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 no. Two more bolts. That's the link.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that comes back to now you're on it in the moment, you know?
Yeah.
So your in the moment reflection of how it feels and what the grade might be, what the difficulty is far more appropriate than, oh, I thought about it for a year and now I can definitively say it's this hard.
Yeah.
So I'm glad Stefano stepped up a couple days later and said, here's what I really think. Instead of 8 months down the road changing the grade on his scorecard and saying, okay, I at the time I thought it was this and I went with this grade, but now I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it's great to have this level of honesty, this level of um,
Maturity.
open conversation, maturity, right? From these guys, not getting upset, not feeling like I have to take this grade because Alex Megos said it was this grade. I'm going to be honest about it. And then Alex going, yeah, I'm really glad you were. Thank you for this. I agree that this could be the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Like this, I think it's great. I mean, this is not a type of conversation that is normal around downgrading. Not
Right.
even at that high of a level. Like there are hurt feelings. Like
Hmm.
it comes off, often it can come off as a personal slight.
Yeah.
Like,
And
which,
sometimes it is
I mean,
realistically.
yeah. Yeah, it definitely can be. Um, so yeah, you want to get into, I guess, talking about why things get downgraded, why things never get upgraded, things like that. Like,
Hmm.
why do you think, is there a reason why things need to be downgraded?
That's an interesting question, actually. I think it honestly matters more in the position that Stefano and Alex and Adam and Seb and that crew of climbers who are at the top of the sport. I think it matters a lot more for them. It matters for them to like lay the groundwork of progression
Hmm.
for the sport. Does it matter if my V8 gets downgraded to V7? No, not at all. That's not gonna it's not gonna hurt my feelings. First off, though, there are people out there who they'll have climbed 13A or whatever. And then if someone says, oh, that's probably more like 12D, they get offended by that. And, there is intent when people say things like that, and it can be a harmful intention, or it could just be, 6 months down the road, they say it on their 8A, and then person A sees it and is like, oh, I can't believe they said this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but there are plenty of times where I've climbed something and maybe it's new beta that comes out, um, or just simply like I climb it and I'm like, yeah, I think this V8 is probably V7, but I won't say anything because I know someone who may have just climbed it and they're like, this is
Totally.
my first V8. And I'm like, yeah, it is. And I'm gonna say it is too because I don't want to be a dick. Like, and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, this is, I don't know, like, what is the difference in me saying this is either like my 150th V8 or like my 300th V7? Like, it doesn't matter to me, but this brings joy to them. And like, especially, yeah, I would rather, like, there are times where, and I'm saying as far as this because I log things on 8A. So, like, and if
Yeah.
someone sees it, otherwise it'd be great. If you don't log anything, awesome. You can like think whatever you want. Um, but yeah, there's been plenty of times where I will not comment on a grade because I'm afraid of, yeah, I don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. I've also definitely felt bad because I've been the guy who I have done like, the 13A or B and been like, oh, it's probably 12D, log it
Yeah.
as such. And then like 2 years later, I get a DM in my Instagram, like, I can't believe you called this 12D.
Yeah,
I'm like,
totally. And I've been the person who like dances around it in conversation. If somebody is like, oh, I really want to do this route, it's this grade. And I'm like, yeah, I've done that route. I did it before the sit down rest was found, and it felt light on that end of the grade when I did it, and you're dancing around saying, oh, I don't think it's that hard. Um, which is an interesting place to be, I'm a person who I believe that grades are necessary. I think it's important to try and measure our progression,
yeah.
the progression of the sport, like Stefano, Alex, Adam are doing, or our own progression as individual climbers. I think it's a necessary thing.
Hmm.
But I've spent a lot of time wrestling with the idea of grades and what they mean to me. And for me, it's a matter of a gauge for how much it might challenge me. And then if I find a V7 that challenges me more than this V10, great. I'm more interested in that challenge. So as a result, I've wrestled with, do I take the guidebook grade? Do I, do I be honest about my thought of the grade?
Hmm.
What's the way to go about this? It's a personal challenge to me. Does it mean anything to anyone else if I do it one way or the other? And I'm still not sure. It's a complicated topic.
It is. And I mean, also, like, it would be complicated enough if we had consistent ideas of how we were actually performing, but
Yeah.
we don't. Like,
Hmm.
one season, I'm going to have way more endurance. Another season, I'm going to be more powerful. Another season, my fingers are going to be stronger, but maybe only in full crimps, not in pockets. Things change. Like, when you
Right.
are a brand new climber, pretty much every week, everything gets better. It's amazing. Your endurance, strength, power, all things improve, basically linearly for a while. Then you hit a certain point to where things don't improve unless you specifically work on them. Like, you've been climbing 4 years. If you aren't working on your endurance isn't gonna get better just by continuing to climb like you have been. Your power isn't gonna keep getting better unless you're focusing on it. And once you've been climbing, 15 plus years, especially like you look at a lot of these guys, there's such a difference in specific shapes. Like, I remember Adam Ondra he went out to England and he tried Rain Shadow. Steve McClure's
Mm.
15B.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Rain Shadow, Rain Dog, whichever one the 15B is, I forget. There's a 9A and like the 15B. Either way, he went out and tried it, and he came down. He was like, "Yeah, I think it's hard, but this is a very specific style, and I'm not in shape for this." Even though I think he climbed like 15C literally the month before. Like
Right.
he was going out just smashing things. He was like, this is a very specific style. I'm not fit for this, so I don't fully know, but it feels hard. I'm going to say it's probably 15B. Like either way, great job, Steve McClure. But this is Adam Ondra, king of the world, greatest rock climber, and this is a grade below, 2 grades below what he climbs, and he still was like, I don't know. It's just specific. He was in route shape, just not this route shape.
Right.
Like, so we have these big changes, but also anyone who's trained consistently knows that day to day performance fluctuates. Even if you eat well, you sleep well, you've rested, man, sometimes you just go in and it's hard to tell with climbing. But if you lift weights, or honestly, like for me, I find hangboarding to be something that can fluctuate a lot. Like
Definitely.
like I can, if I wake up and I feel good, for me, lifting weights or strength training, pretty consistent, with a little variance. But hangboarding, who knows? Like, man, like it's got global consistency across months. But man, there are some days where I'm like, man, I'm coming off a rest day. I feel good. I've done everything smart, drank a lot of water, slept great. Oh, just struggle.
Yep.
And but sometimes those are the days you go out to your project and you don't know it, and you just fight as hard as you absolutely can, and you send it, and you're like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And as far as your exertion level you put out, maybe it is. But had you come out on a day where everything was just like going perfectly and your body was ready for it, maybe it would have been one of those events where you climb it and you're like, oh, it was almost like I didn't even have to try. I was on autopilot, and I can easily climb another grade harder.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a, we often do that. We often, send a thing. We have like the magic attempt and we find this flow state and everything comes together and you're firing on all cylinders and the thing goes down and it feels easy.
It's
We hear
amazing.
that story all the time. And then we take that one attempt, the outlier attempt, the perfect everything came together attempt, and we go, well, it felt easy, so it must be this great. Forget the 30 other attempts where I was thinking, oh, this thing must be this hard. No, it's
Yeah.
this easy because I did it this easy, you
Yeah.
know.
You had this one unicorn moment and you base everything on that one.
Yeah, and there's so much wrapped up into how we decide to define the challenge that it gave us. There's our own self-worth. There's our own view of our own abilities. Oh, well, if I did it, it can't be this hard, you
Oh, I
know?
hear that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And people don't give themselves enough credit in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
Um, I think these guys, Stefano, Alex, Adam, they might have a better handle on what they're capable of. Also, maybe not. I'm totally spitballing here, um, but they've spent enough time at this difficult grade to
Hmm.
have an idea, anyway, at least of how it feels to them. I also want to highlight, though, it could be 15D for Alex and 15C for Stefano.
Yeah.
That maybe it felt that way.
Maybe 16A for Andra.
Yeah, we don't have to always agree on what the grade is. We just don't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for different body types, different styles, like things are just going to feel harder.
Yeah, there are things we can change about our climbing, and there are things we can't change. We can't change our height. If there
Hmm.
are no intermediates, if you can't reach the holds, it's going to be dramatically harder for you, most likely.
Yeah.
Um, we can't change a lot of the things that contribute to the difficulty of a rock climb. A lot of the things we can. If you're just bad at two finger pockets, that doesn't mean the route is harder. That just means you need to up that skill for yourself. You need to level up on two finger pockets. That's a tough thing to know, though. It feels this hard. Is it something I can change or something I can't?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's tough. What situations? Okay, so we've talked about how, downgrading is obviously a thing, like, and it shouldn't be, ideally it shouldn't be personal. What are
Mm.
some good reasons that things should be downgraded? Like, why do things get overgraded?
I think there are a lot of reasons. Having been involved in a community like at the Red, where there was this really great community built by Ray Ellington and Yasmin Fowler, and this whole group of people who put together this online guidebook and point system for climbing in the Red. And it created this really great sense of competition, and people were out really getting after it.
Yeah.
And however, what would happen is somebody would put up a new route and they would have their own way to grade. I remember there was a small crew of people putting up a lot of first ascents who graded based on how hard it should feel on the on-site,
Oh,
which is not the like standard accepted method of grading as I understand it.
yeah. Everything's
Um,
515 in rifle.
exactly, exactly. So those routes for a better on-siter would feel drastically easier than the given grade.
Hmm.
So people would go there, climb those, relatively new climbers, and their idea of, they would work it, work it, work it, do it, and then they'd be like, well, 12B is supposed to feel like this. So then they would go do an old school 12B and they would be like, this isn't 12B, this is 12D at least. I know I've done these two 12Bs.
Yeah.
So I do think that trying to grade things accurately, I think I'm answering your question here. Uh, Trying to grade things accurately will, in some sense, uh, create a better environment for the people coming up through the grades and learning them, and create an environment that is less caustic when the
Hmm.
grades wildly vary from place to place, route to route, boulder to boulder, whatever, and maybe reduce a lot of the well, this can't be this grade. I know it's not because I've done these two. That kind of attitude, that kind of discussion that never ends up in a good place.
Yeah.
I would like to believe that. I don't know if I do, but I would like to.
Yeah. It's tough, like, because there's no like 12A measuring stick.
Right.
And if anything, that's where, it's kind of like what you were saying. That's where I think a lot of issues can derive from. And you see it going both ways. Like, you know, in Waco tanks, full service is considered the benchmark V10. John Sherman, when making the V grades, he was like, this is it. This is V10. Let me tell you, I think that thing's. I've, I've done quite a few V11s out there. Not many are as hard as this thing.
Yeah.
Like, is how I feel.
Same.
But a lot of people will be like, anytime they climb anything out there, they're like, oh, I don't think this is V10. It's not as hard as full service.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, I mean, to me, like, even though, yes, he called it the benchmark, it's also polished with age, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Most people who have climbed it are like, yeah, if it's harder than full service, it's V11. Like, that's just the standard. But there are some of us in that group, but then there are people who are in the other group who are like, well, if it's easier than V full service, it has to be V9. And I've even heard someone try and argue that it's full service is V9, which makes no sense. Um, It's like, wait, hold on, it's the actual benchmark. It is the one, but um, so yeah, like we don't have benchmarks for what a grade should be, and even if we did, like, is that the upper end? Is that the middle? Like, there has to be a spectrum, right? Like, we can't say
Yeah.
everything is exactly this, or we would need, 26 letter. We need to use all 26 letters for every, 512 for every 513, like every single number
Right.
grade.
It's just going to get more and more confusing, and full service is a really great example. I hear it brought up often when trying to decide if something's V10 or not, same as you, but John never did it. John never climbed the thing. So can he definitively say this is V10? I don't know. Do you have to be able to do you have to climb the thing before you can give it a definitive grade?
Oh, that's kind of funny.
Um, I don't know.
I had never really connected the dots on that one. Yeah, I don't know. So you have
And I'm
that.
sure, Dale Goddard did the FA and Dale may have called it V10. But we very often come back to, well, Verm created the scale and he called this V10, so it must be the gold standard for V10.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if he gets to have that badge because he never actually climbed the thing.
Yeah, I don't know. So it's tough. Um, yeah, but I mean, so a lot of things get developed. So what we see often is things get developed, and normally you will see a lot of the highest end climbers. They'll put things up, and then they start to get a lot of repeats, and then the grades eventually start to dwindle. Very normal. Like you look at a lot of the stuff like Dave Graham, Daniel Woods, all those guys who put up stuff in Colorado, things normally end up dropping 1 to 2 number grades with time. I mean, but it kind of makes sense. New beta comes out, um, and a lot of times you can see the original FA beta because they have video of it, and it's like, oh, there's a new foot that people use now. Or what'll happen sometimes too is someone will grade based on an area. So this happened in Arkansas. Dave Graham went out there. There weren't many hard things already established. He climbed what was, and he was kind of just graded based on that. Which, for someone who travels as much as he does, that kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, I'm going to recalibrate. This is what V12 feels like here. This is what V13 feels like here. I'll grade based on that. And a lot of those things he put up got downgraded, 1 and 2, I think sometimes even more grades. But a lot of those things he first based on also got downgraded. And it was just a
Right.
matter of this was an area that wasn't as popular then. People hadn't climbed there a whole lot and hadn't had time to settle out. Like beta hadn't been found.
Right.
Consensus just wasn't reached.
Right. And if you have a, V14, V15 climber coming in and doing V12 first ascents, it's likely he didn't find the best sequence, the best beta, because he can do it the V13 way, the V12 way. There might be a V11 way or a V10 way that he just didn't see because the V12 way feels just as easy for him, or her. And
Yeah.
I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah. You know,
And one thing, I think the biggest takeaway of this situation for all of us should be that being honest about the grades, whether it's a downgrade or an upgrade, shouldn't feel like a slight at all to the first ascensionist. It shouldn't feel like, uh, you know, boosting yourself up because you did this harder thing if you're upgrading, or, diminishing your accomplishment if you downgrade it. That's not what it is. This isn't a personal thing. We're just trying to measure the level of challenge that this is going to give to the average climber.
hmm
So we should stop taking it personal. I think that should be the biggest takeaway here.
yeah. No, and I don't know. It's all tough because also like, I do think about the people who like one common thing you'll start seeing a lot of downgrades from certain people when they've really like hit their stride. Um,
Hmm.
like it's not
And they just
uncommon.
don't they just don't know yet that they've hit their stride.
Totally.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will go back and like redact things that they've maybe downgraded, but you'll see someone who maybe they finally trained for the first time, or, just maybe some life stress is settled out or whatever. They got really psyched. They're going hard, haven't climbed outside in a little bit. They go out and suddenly they're like, oh, the world is soft. Everything I touch feels so much easier than it ever has. So everything must be soft or the wrong grade.
Hmm.
It's like, oh man, maybe you're actually just real strong. You know,
Hmm.
like this is kind of what happened with James Litz. Like, I guess he was climbing around North Carolina, climbing around the whole Southeast, establishing things. And it wasn't until he went out west and started climbing things that he was like, oh, like I don't. I've always heard that he like wouldn't grade anything V10 or was something along those lines. Went out and started climbing on established boulders, and he was like, oh, never mind. I was very wrong.
Right.
Like he
Right.
just
There's
didn't.
also the phenomenon like we've seen in horse pens quite a lot where somebody will get this thing ruthlessly wired and then say, "Oh, well, it feels this hard."
Yep,
You know, and that becomes the new de facto grade when the reality is that same person 4 years earlier, 300 ascents earlier, thought something entirely different. You
totally.
know?
It's I feel the same way about like a pumperama and rifle.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
people who've used it as a trainer, they end their day by going over doing a couple laps on it. 5 years later, they're like, oh, it's probably 12D. It's like, yeah, you've done it 400 times. Like,
Right.
I'm
Right.
sure it feels like 1280. Doesn't make it
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. You've lost your ability to grade this objectively.
Yeah,
You know, if there is such a thing.
yeah. Um, yeah. What are some other, holds break? Things get harder or easier. Hold breaking can actually make things a lot easier, which sounds
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah. A bigger hold can appear there. I think technology plays a big part in the grade. One thing, like I think we've seen this at Waco, where the technology is drastically altering the grades of a lot of boulders in Waco. But some people really refuse to alter those grades, whether it's a inflating of their own personal ability or worth or whatever, or it's a sort of a reverence to the first ascensionist. Well, Fred said it was this. I'm like, yeah, I
Yeah,
know, but Fred didn't even know what knee bars were back then. And
yeah,
he certainly didn't have the sticky rubber knee bar pads. And he was so strong that he did it in a day and didn't find the best sequences. So we have to adjust for all of those things, or I think we're doing a disservice to everyone. They do this one thing that's called V11 or something, when in reality they're doing it with the new sequence, with the new technology. They're probably doing it in a method that's closer to something like V9. Then they go out and get on a V11 where they can't use those same tricks, that it has been adjusted, and their ego gets shattered because they're like, "Oh, I'm not as good as I thought I was." So I think we're doing a disservice by allowing the grades to stay high when they're not. And I personally, when I approach a grade, I'm like, okay, this could be 1.5 grades in either direction. Realistically, it could feel that way to me today, period. If it's V10, it might be soft V9. It might feel like hard V11. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. It and it's tough. Like, oh man, I remember my first day in Yosemite when I went bouldering there many years ago. Um, I can't remember the name of the boulders, but there's a V5 left of, I think it's called Conan the Conan the Barbarian is like a V9. Left of it's a V5. It's like athletic something or sport.
Mm.
I tried this for like 3 hours and
Hmm.
only did the crux move once. And it's an overhanging like power climb on edges. And I was like, oh, I guess this is just what Yosemite's going to be like. And here's what's funny is I ended up posting a photo of it. Didn't say anything. I was just like, oh, just got to Yosemite, tried, and tried this thing. Wasn't able to do it. That was it. I didn't post anything about like the grade or whatever. I got not only just like DMs about it, I got people texting me like on my cell phone being like, hey, that's like the most fucked up thing I've ever tried. And and it gave me such a peace of mind, which is ridiculous. It shouldn't. But they were like, yeah, it's like harder than the V9 next to it, all these different things. But it's funny because that completely reshaped how I looked at Yosemite, hearing from those people. Otherwise, I would have been like, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't even be trying V5 out here.
Right. And, Yosemite, I think, is a great example of if you don't have Ron Calc like ability to stand on granite, then maybe you can't accurately know what the grades there should be. Doesn't matter if you've climbed V15 on sandstone. You come to Yosemite and you try a V5 slab, you might just fall, and you might, in your ego say, well, this is at least V13. I don't fall off of V5, but you don't have Ron Calc's ability to stand on that granite. It's something he's honed over time, and you just haven't learned yet. There's so much that goes into all these grades. We just can't take it personal.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean I won't, but it
Yeah,
shouldn't.
same. I'll keep taking it personal as well, though I'm trying my best not to, and not to get caught up in it, and just constantly re-examining my relationship with grades, because I think they are important, but we shouldn't let them be so important.
Yeah. Like it's, I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. Like, I mean, I've seen grades ruin friendships.
Yeah, totally. And I'm glad it did not in this case. I'm glad it came out the way that it did. I applaud both of these guys for their honesty, their sincerity, for not, letting it be this personal, too much of a personal thing, and, just pushing the sport further. I think it's really important. It's a good thing for people to see. And I look forward to the day when we don't have to have these conversations, when Stefano can just say, oh, it felt like this grade to me, and nobody's feelings are hurt, and everyone understands it. And we all just understand grades are subjective. When you see a number, there is a range on either side of it that could potentially feel that way. That's just the way grades are. So I look forward to that.
Uh, I hope your dream comes true one day.
uh, don't be a pessimist, Nate.
No.
I'm trying not to be a pessimist, and I'm the eternal pessimist. So
I've got to find the equal in this conversation.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah,
I mean, that's all I've got to say about it, unless you've got more here. I think it's just an interesting conversation a lot of us should be having with ourselves and our friends and our partners, and,
yeah,
trying to
and
be better about it.
yeah, and don't take it. I won't say don't. Try not to take it personally.
Yeah.
Um, when grades are brought up, like your experience is going to be different, man, and it's just hard saying. Um, so I had a couple people message me when this downgrade happened, and they clearly wanted my opinion because I also climbed 15D. Um, which is what
Yeah, of
that's why we're
course.
having this conversation. We're both clearly the authorities on
Well,
15C versus
I stood
15D.
on the ground and looked at that route, and I can tell you right now, it's not this hard.
Exactly. I watched the video of Alex Megos climbing on it, and I got to say,
I
I
saw
thought
how big those holds were.
it looked pretty soft in the video. Just me. Um,
Uh,
uh, and one thing that was brought up a lot was silence, because people are like, well, why is everyone going to Ceuse to try bibliography? There's
mm,
blood in the water, clearly. Like, things got to be soft if the world's a leader going to bibliography and not silence. Why is that?
interesting.
So what are your thoughts? Why do you think people are going to bibliography and not going to
Well,
Flatinger Cave?
I've given Alex Megos a lot of praise in this episode, so I'm gonna throw a little shade at him.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I was doing a live Q&A with Alex Megos at the Red at Rocktoberfest with the crowd, and someone asked him if he was going to go try silence. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I'm inspired by the lines. And have you seen silence? No. So I think a lot of people are inspired by the line. They're inspired by um, the story. And I think Alex Megos's story and obviously the line is gorgeous. It's on a world famous wall with a lot of history. So I think a lot of the best climbers are going there. Plus it's it's an easier trip. It's a easy, well-established trip for
Hmm.
these guys. There are lots of other routes there they can do. It's not such a specific style as silence. Um, Silence is a monster of a route that's hard to work.
Yeah.
Um, we saw that in a lot of Adam's videos. So even though the grade might be the same or might be similar, there's certainly it's a much bigger bite to take to try and go work out silence. Adam had built up the resistance, the style of that cave over many, many hard routes, successively harder and harder. So it was the next logical step for him.
Hmm.
It could be years of work for somebody to get to that place in that cave, whereas Ceuse is a more known entity. So
Yeah.
shade with all due respect, Alex Megos.
No, I mean, I get it. Like we did our Adamandra episode recently for the patrons,
Yeah,
and researching for that, I was reading about silence, and that was a comment that someone made about it. They were like, "Yeah, if you walk up into the Flatinger Cave, you would never guess which one silence is if you weren't familiar with
right.
like the crack boulder problem. It kind of like it's not a standout line. It kind of just finishes in the middle of the wall. It doesn't stand out at all. There's like the famous, what is it, Odin's Eye in
Yeah,
that cave, goes through the giant big
the big
piece
eye
of
feature.
eye feature. Yeah, there's a lot of like standout features there. This ain't it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair statement. My response to anyone who brought up silence is I was like, well, it's kind of fucked. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you watch Anamandra climbing on it, and I don't think, oh man, that's a dream line. Hold on, let me print a poster of this, like to hang on my
Right.
wall. Like
Yeah,
it,
and something we talked about in the Adam Under episode is I think that's one of his strengths. He doesn't need the line to be super inspiring. He's inspired by the difficulty. And I think that's one of the things that helps him be the world's best rock climber.
yeah, yeah, it's amazing. But you look at, I think Perfecto Mundo kind of goes in line in this whole storyline. It's a 15C up a 45. It's like jugs for a couple bolts to just some power endurance with a hard boulder in it on pockets. Like,
Just some jugs.
well, the first few bolts. Um, but like it's a rock climber's rock climb. You're gripping grabs, knuckling down and
Yeah,
hucking meat. Like,
right.
it makes sense that people would flock to that thing because it just makes sense. Like, it doesn't have an inverted jamming V15 on it like the 15D Onder put up. As far like, or even if you want to look at 15Cs, it's like change looks wild. It's got that crazy like
Yeah.
roof double Gaston like knee bar scum thing.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's like, can I just grab some holds and pull a long ways? Like Jakob Schubert was psyched. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and that's, I think bibliography fits that same bill. It's
Totally
grip,
does.
it's grip and grabs. Like, people know
Yeah.
how to do this. This is a much more attainable style than silence. Like, I think also, I mean, if we've seen anything from World Cups, being a high level rock climber does not mean you know how to jam at all.
I wasn't sure where you were going with that, but that's 1000% true.
And I think whenever silence was first put up, some people are like, I don't know. I mean, does he really have the chops to say that this is V15 crack climbing?
Right.
And I think he's proved time and time again, yeah, like he's good enough in those kinds of styles, and he is dominant enough in all things jamming that I think he can probably say it.
Right. And that, that boulder problem might be easier with like board lasted shoes or something,
Hmm.
and hand jammies on or something. But are you going to climb the rest of the route with those 2x4s strapped to your foot? Probably not.
Totally. And he actually, so Pete Whitaker of Wide Boys went out and was like, I just want to see if I can do all the moves individually. And he did it by hook and by crook and did all, I think he did maybe all the moves, or I don't think he could get his feet into the crack, but if he started with them already inverted in the crack, he was
Mm,
able to get through. And he did a different sequence than Adam Ondra did. And it was funny because they posted the video clearly very kind of tongue in cheek, and
right.
maybe Andrew took it a little seriously, but he was like, "Oh yes, this is great. What funny Brits you are." But for real, you would never be able to climb the rest of this rock climb in that stiff and flat of a shoe.
It's
But
totally true.
good joke, guys. Good joke. I'm laughing here. Yep.
Yeah. So, that don't take it personal. I think that's what it comes down to. Remember that grades are subjective. Remember they can be all over the place, and it's not a reflection on your self-worth. If something you thought felt really hard, somebody else finds an easier way.
Yeah.
Just what it is.
Absolutely. And the time you put in, like, let's say if you climb something, I mean, and this has happened to me in Waco. I climbed a boulder that for me was hard. I put in more days than I'd ever put in on like that level of a boulder before, and I was super proud of it. And a year later, someone found like 6 knee bars through it.
Yeah.
They, and in their opinion, they were like, it could be 3 grades easier. And you know what? For me, I was like, hey, that's okay. I was almost bummed because I was like, oh, this is how everyone's going to climb it now. And I loved the experience I got to have, but it didn't mean I didn't put in that work. It was still
Right.
like a hard effort. Like I still climbed the thing I climbed, even
Yeah.
if, let's say a guidebook's going to call it something different in the future. Like that whole experience, and honestly, just for looking at what I gained physically, technically, tactically from that boulder, I still retain all of those benefits.
Yeah. Yeah. The confidence you got from it
Yeah.
all of that builds on who you are as a climber. So, and
Yeah.
that can't be taken away. All right. This is the kind of conversation that our patrons get more of every month. We mentioned the Adam Ondra episode recently. We've been talking about the influence of specific climbers on the progression of the sport in the training world, the climbing world, how we interact with climbing and engage with it. And we do these types of board meetings for the patrons. You can get those 2 a month extra for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Power Company Podcast. You can also find the link right there in your show notes or right there in the description if you're on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe button. We would appreciate that. We're always working on other video content as well. And for the rest of us, for the rest of you, you can find us at powercompanyclimbing.com. You can find us on the Instagrams, the Facebooks at Power Company Climbing, probably still on the Pinterest. I haven't logged into there in years, so I'm not actually sure. Um, and you should tweet this episode out on the Twitter machine, but we will not see it, like it. I don't know if you like on Twitter. I have no idea because we don't tweet. We scream like eagles.
Structure audio.